Let me take you into the mind of a man who didn't just build a company. He built a new way of thinking. A man who didn't follow the world's rules. He rewrote them. Today we're breaking down the Steve Jobs blueprint. Not the biography, not the usual cliches, but the actual mental frameworks, psychological patterns, and strategic decisions that turned a rebellious college dropout into one of the most influential figures in human history. Because if there's one thing most people misunderstand about Steve Jobs, it's this. He wasn't successful because he was a genius. He wasn't successful because he was born special. And he definitely wasn't successful just because he had big ideas. Steve Jobs won because he approached creativity, business, product design, and human behavior in a way nobody else dared to. This is the blueprint behind it. Let's begin with the mindset that shaped everything Steve Jobs ever did. The idea that reality is bendable. Jobs believed that most limits are illusions, not metaphors, not motivational talk. He genuinely believed that if you pushed hard enough, insisted long enough, and demanded excellence with enough intensity, reality itself would eventually bend. People close to him called it the reality distortion field. This wasn't delusion. This was belief weaponized. This was conviction so powerful it forced other people to level up or get out of the way. And this belief wasn't magic, it was strategic. Because when you believe something is impossible, you stop trying. But when you believe reality can be bent, you keep pushing until the world has no choice but to move. Think about what this belief created. The personal computer, the smartphone, the modern animation era, the tablet, the digital music revolution. A trillion-dollar company that outlived him, a culture that defines modern design. No man reshaped consumer technology more than Steve Jobs. And it all started with a simple worldview. Reality is negotiable. But here's the second part of the blueprint. Something almost no one outside of Apple really understands. Steve Jobs was obsessed with end-to-end control. Not because he was a control freak in the emotional sense, but because he believed that excellence comes from integration, not randomness. Most companies design something, then hand it off to another team, then outsource the software, then modify the hardware, then let marketing figure it out at the end. Jobs saw this as chaos. He wanted everything from the silicon to the packaging to the store layout aligned with the same philosophy, the same intention, and the same vision. End-to-end control let Apple do something no other company could. Design the experience, not the product. That's why Apple devices feel coherent. Why the brand feels unified. Why customers feel emotionally connected. Jobs didn't build products. He built worlds. And that brings us to the next part of the blueprint. Simplicity at all costs. Most companies add features to impress people. They think complexity equals value. They think more is better. Jobs believed the opposite. He believed that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. Simplicity forces clarity. Simplicity forces intention. Simplicity forces design to serve purpose, not ego. When Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, the company had dozens of product lines and confusion everywhere. Jobs walked in, took a marker, drew a simple 4-square grid and said, "We build 4 products now, consumer and pro desktops, consumer and pro laptops, everything else is gone." He wasn't just cutting products. He was cutting noise, cutting waste, cutting distraction, cutting anything that didn't move the vision forward. And that's another crucial piece of his blueprint. The courage to kill good ideas to protect great ones. Jobs believed that focus isn't about what you say yes to. It's about the 1,000 things you say no to. If it wasn't revolutionary, if it wasn't elegant, if it didn't fit the story he wanted Apple to tell, it was gone. This ability to reject mediocrity, violently, repeatedly, unapologetically, was one of the sharpest tools in his arsenal. But here's something even deeper. Steve Jobs understood that people don't buy products, they buy identity. Apple didn't sell computers, it sold creativity, rebellion, individuality. The Think Different campaign wasn't a slogan, it was the brand's soul. It was a declaration that Apple wasn't here to compete with other computers. It was here to empower the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the round pegs and the square holes. Jobs understood that great brands don't reflect their products, they reflect their users. And by building a brand people wanted to identify with, He built loyalty so strong it became cultural. But branding alone isn't enough to build a legacy. Another central part of the Steve Jobs blueprint is his relationship with taste. Jobs believed that taste, refined, disciplined, elite taste, was the most underrated advantage in business and creativity. He surrounded himself with art, with calligraphy, with design history. He studied simplicity in Zen architecture. He obsessed over typography. He believed that beauty matters, not as decoration, but as a form of communication. Great taste allowed him to make decisions other leaders couldn't even see. Most companies think design equals aesthetics. Jobs believed design equals how something works, how it feels, how it guides human behavior. This is why the iPod wheel made sense. This is why the iPhone eliminated buttons. This is why the Macintosh was friendly instead of industrial. Good design entertains. Great design disappears. Jobs pursued the kind of design that feels inevitable after you see it. Another part of the blueprint was his obsession with storytelling. Jobs didn't present products. He built narratives. He understood that the human brain is wired for stories, not specs. When he unveiled the first iPhone, he didn't talk about RAM or processors. He told a story about the problem with smartphones and how Apple reimagined them from scratch. He knew that people don't remember facts, they remember emotions. And that brings us to the emotional engine behind his leadership style. Jobs demanded excellence at a level that made people uncomfortable. He held people to standards they didn't think they could reach, and that made him polarizing. But here's the truth. High expectations don't come from ego, they come from belief. Jobs didn't push people to break them, he pushed them to break their limits. Employees would produce work they believed was the best they could do. Jobs would reject it instantly, and then somehow, they would return days later with something dramatically better. He knew people rarely know their own potential, and he built a culture where excellence was not a goal. It was the minimum requirement. But here's the part of his blueprint most people overlook. Steve Jobs was incredibly patient. He wasn't chasing short-term wins. He wasn't optimizing for quarterly profits. He wasn't creating products for what the market wanted today. He was creating products for the world he believed would exist tomorrow. Patience allowed him to outlast trends, outthink competitors, and build technologies that didn't make sense until years later. The iPhone wasn't inevitable when it launched. The world had to catch up. And Apple made the world catch up because Jobs played the long game. Now let's examine the part of his blueprint that shaped his creativity more than anything else. His obsession with connecting dots. Jobs believed that creative people aren't magical. They're collectors of experiences, collectors of ideas, collectors of influences from fields outside their own. He took calligraphy classes for fun. He studied meditation, he traveled to India, he explored counterculture. He surrounded himself with thinkers and artists who challenged him. These dots eventually connected into innovations that changed the world. Because innovation doesn't come from staring at your own industry, it comes from cross-pollination. Jobs didn't just think differently, he saw differently. But here's the real core of the blueprint, the part that explains everything he ever did. Steve Jobs was driven by purpose. Not money, not fame, not validation, purpose. He wanted to empower creativity. He wanted to humanize technology. He wanted to make tools for the mind that advanced humanity. When purpose drives you, the work becomes inevitable, the vision becomes non-negotiable, and the obstacles become irrelevant. Jobs once said, remembering that you're going to die is the best tool you have for making big decisions. He lived with urgency, he created with urgency, and he pushed with urgency. Because he knew time was limited, and he wasn't going to waste it living someone else's life. And that leaves us with the final part of the Steve Jobs blueprint, legacy. The greatest test of leadership is what happens after you're gone. And more than a decade later, Apple still operates with his DNA. The culture persists, the philosophy persists, the design language persists, the obsession with simplicity persists, the quest for perfection persists. Jobs didn't build a company, he built an institution. And that's the true lesson here. The Steve Jobs blueprint isn't about being like him. It's about thinking independently, relentlessly, obsessively. It's about refusing to accept limits. It's about demanding excellence from yourself and your work. It's about bringing intention, taste, clarity, and courage into the things you create. It's about playing the long game. It's about telling stories that matter. It's about believing deeply enough in your vision to fight for it. Greatness doesn't come from talent, it comes from conviction. Conviction so strong it shapes the world around it. And that is the Steve Jobs blueprint. If this breakdown gave you a new perspective, subscribe, drop a comment with which blueprint legend I should break down next, and I'll see you in the next video.